Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. And before we get into it, there is no visual today. So if you're one of my friends that loves to watch on YouTube and is wondering why there is no visual, well, we had a heat wave here in SoCal. It is humid. It is hot. It is gross. It is sticky. If I turn off my fans and I close my windows and I close the door and put on these lights that I use for filming and then put, my normal amount of bronzer on my face, you'll never hear from me again. I will melt. I will never recover from that in this heat wave. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you it is over 85 degrees in my apartment. So that's my rant. Actually, that's it. That's the whole episode. That's it. I'm done. I'm pissed off about no AC. But in all seriousness, I think the temperature is going to come down a little bit and I will get back to the visuals next week. So that aside, welcome back to the podcast where we cut through the noise, throw a little shade, and get real about the stories that actually matter in the LGBTQ plus community. As I said, I'm Josh, and on today's episode, it's kind of a big one. It's going to be a little bit lengthy. We're going to dive into 3 very powerful stories that caught my attention just this week alone. Stories that show how far we've come, how far we still have to go, and it's quite a ways, let me remind you, and why visibility and activism remain so incredibly crucial. So first up, we're going to talk about 2 men in Indonesia who were sentenced to a public caning for simply hugging and kissing. Yes, you heard that right. Then we're going to move on to a Yosemite National Park worker where a park ranger was fired after flying the trans flag. And the hypocrisy here is absolutely wild. And then finally, the last story, we're going to dig into this bombshell story about queer employees being forced out of the NSA and new policies that allow surveillance based on gender identity. And it is as terrifying as it sounds, but there's a lot of very confusing information out there. It's not all as it seems. So I dove really deep into all 3 of these stories in terms of research to get as much information as I could so I could provide you with the facts and not the confusing shit that is out there on random ass TikTok accounts. So grab your coffee, grab your tea, maybe make yourself a mimosa because we have a lot to unpack. So let's hit it. Part 1. 2 men sentenced to a public caning in Aceh, Indonesia. In August 2025, an Islamic court in Banda Aceh, a city in Indonesia's Aceh province, handed 2 college students, ages 20 and 21, a sentence of 80 lashes each, administered publicly. And why, you might be asking? Because they were caught hugging and kissing in a public bathroom. That is it. That simple gesture was deemed a sexual act under local law. The case was tried in secret, behind closed doors, at Sharia court. The men, whose identities remain unknown, had been arrested in April after a patrol broke into the restroom where they were discovered. Prosecutors had originally asked for 85 lashes, but the judges showed some leniency, citing their good behavior, cooperation, and lack of a criminal record, and even deducted the 4 months they'd spent in detention. So that's how they landed on 80 strokes, 80 lashes or canings, whatever. This is not even close to being an isolated incident. Aceh is the only Indonesian province that's allowed to enforce Islamic law, including caning for so-called morality offenses like homosexuality, gambling, and even women wearing tight clothing. It's been this way since 2006, thanks to a peace deal. Interesting name, peace deal, when people are being lashed in public. These are not mythical penalties. You can't brush this off as cultural misunderstanding. Dozens of people have been publicly flogged over the years in Aceh for homosexuality. Just earlier in 2025, 2 other men aged 18 and 24 were caned, 77 and then 82 lashes, for having consensual sex. So let's pause there for a moment and hold that weight. There are some consequences for intimacy, consensual intimacy between adults. So yes, homosexuality, essentially, it's illegal there. So why is this happening in Aceh? Why caning and who has the power here? So Aceh's system stems from a 2006 peace agreement when the central government granted the province autonomy in exchange for ending separatist conflict. As a concession, Aceh was allowed to implement Islamic law, including caning as judicial punishment. That means even though Indonesia's national criminal code does not criminalize homosexuality, Aceh effectively does, publicly and savagely. Human rights groups have condemned these actions as egregious, which, if you're not following, is my new favorite word. They're egregious violations of fundamental rights. The Human Dignity Trust and others point out that these laws conflict with Indonesia's obligations under international treaties. So let's talk national versus regional here, because I heard a lot of people, saying this is only one region where that is illegal. There's a bunch of other islands and beautiful places in Indonesia where it is safe for the LGBTQ plus to go. So let's zoom out. Indonesia does not have a national law criminalizing homosexuality, but regional laws like those in Aceh and South Sumatra do criminalize consensual same-sex activity. On top of that, there's the 2008 pornography law. It's vague, sweeping, and has become a tool for persecuting LGBTQ plus communities nationwide. Raids on parties, like one near Jakarta in June 2025, which resulted in 75 people being arrested, have happened under this law. People were charged based on condoms, sex toys, and a sword for performance. A sword for a performance. Like, that doesn't even track. That doesn't make sense. Even more chilling is the 2022 Criminal Code, which bans sex outside of marriage, a law that, while gender neutral, disproportionately targets LGBTQ plus people, since same-sex marriage doesn't exist in Indonesia. That goes into effect in 2025. So you see how other places are kind of working around this and making laws appear as though they mean something else when they're straight up just a target against the queer community. We're also seeing censorship. So they have bans on showing LGBTQ plus behavior in media, proposed laws restricting transgender performances, and even proposed broadcasting bills that would criminalize online LGBTQ plus content. That's a lot to process, a lot to even think about. So then I'm like, where is it even safe to go and where is it not? So the situation in Indonesia is deeply uneven. While Aceh is among the most dangerous places for queer people, not every island or city is the same. Bali is relatively progressive with LGBTQ plus friendly venues, even pride adjacent events. The capital, Jakarta, offers some discreet safe spaces, though public affection can still be a bit risky. Then we have a place called Yogyakarta, which I practiced saying that because it was a tongue twister, and it is a bit mixed. The Gili Islands and areas like parts of Sulawesi have communities recognizing multiple genders, and that can be much more tolerant there, obviously. But still, discretion is crucial outside of big cities. Even forums like Reddit reinforce this. Somebody wrote, cities such as Jakarta, Bandung, Yogya, Bali, you'd be safe in big cities. Stay away from Aceh. So, noted. Cross it off your bucket list if it was there. Let's not risk it. And here's why this matters. Why am I spending so much time talking about this? Because this isn't in the United States. So why do I care? Because you should fucking care. This story should make every queer person and every ally say this is intolerable. Intimacy, human touch, freedom of love. This is a global issue, not some remote headline. Love between consenting adults should never be criminalized. And the fact that the consequences can be so brutal makes my skin crawl. These students, we don't even know their names, again, no idea, they suffer the wounds we can't fully comprehend, and the law justifies it. I hope human rights groups rally harder. I hope embassies step up. And I hope this story reminds us that queer rights are still fragile everywhere, including places where we thought they weren't. And if you're listening from somewhere with freedom, hold that gently and raise a voice for those who cannot. And while that was a heavy start to the episode, it's about to get heavier. And we are bringing things a little bit more locally. Our second story is one that made me gasp, and I think one that most of us have probably heard about. We're hitting identity, visibility, federal power, and why the trans flag is still so meaningful. So, part two, firing over a trans flag at Yosemite National Park. Let's talk about a non-binary ranger fired from Yosemite National Park for flying a trans pride flag. Here's what happened. In May 2025, a group of climbers, including Shannon S.J. Jocelyn, a non-binary wildlife biologist and ranger at Yosemite, draped a transgender pride flag roughly 55 to 66 feet wide across the face of El Capitan, Yosemite's iconic granite monolith. The flag flew for about 2 hours before being voluntarily removed. This was done on their off-duty time as a personal act of solidarity and visibility, not an official demonstration. It was a way of saying trans people belong in national parks too. But here's where the nightmare begins. The very next day, Yosemite's acting superintendent signed a rule banning flags, banners, or signs larger than 15 square feet in wilderness areas, which are 94% of the park. Hello, it's a national park, so most areas are wilderness areas. This regulation had never existed before and was backdated to cover the day after the flag was displayed. So that is just the beginning of the weird-ass corruption at play. Less than a month from completing their 2-year probation, SJ was terminated, officially for failing to demonstrate acceptable conduct. 2 other rangers involved were placed on administrative leave, and the Department of Justice is reportedly considering charges against park visitors who helped hang the flag. SJ responded with this. El Capitan has had flags hung on it for decades, and no one has ever been punished for it. Only me. And this is not hearsay, people. That flag hanging history includes upside down US flags in protest and stop the genocide banners for Gaza. None of those triggered discipline, so this feels targeted. In their own words, SJ called the act a response to a wave of anti-trans executive orders from the Trump administration, orders that changed federal definitions of sex and limited gender-affirming care. They meant to send a message of inclusion, that parks should be safe for trans folks. And SJ's firing sent the opposite message. And advocates are responding. Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility is representing SJ. The firing has sparked a huge amount of backlash, a direct attack, as one local historian put it. Not just on one person, but on expression, belonging, and representation we thought was non-controversial. Here's a little context because, like I said, there is a lot of flag history and free speech goodness at Yosemite. So again, let's zoom out. Yosemite is more than a park. It's one of the original test beds for national park preservation, protected since the Yosemite Grant of 1864 and designated a national park in 1890. It sees 4 million plus visitors a year, and El Capitan is basically its Mount Rushmore. Flag hanging on El Capitan has been part of its unofficial history. Like I said, protest flags, upside down US flags, whimsical banners like a Jolly Roger crab flag has been flown, even solidarity messages, and none drew penalties. That makes SJ's firing feel both retroactive and discriminatory. The new rule banning large flags, punishable by up to $5,000 in fines and 6 months in jail, was enacted after that pride display. But critics say it reads like a political reaction, not a preservation policy. Federal workers have no guarantee of protected political or personal expression. And these days, under the Trump era directives, parks are facing budget cuts. 2,500 positions have been lost, and a proposed $900 million reduction next year. Just next year. Employees feel like they're being silenced and scapegoated. And here is why this matters. This is not just about one ranger. It's about the culture we want in public spaces. Trans representation at national monuments should not be controversial. Intimacy, identity, visibility, again, these are human rights. SJ stood up in a quiet, powerful way, but it cost them everything. If you've ever felt out of place in the outdoors because nature was coded as white or straight or butch or whatever, just know this. SJ risked it to say that you belong. And right now, let's take a beat. for SJ, for trans people, for expression, and for the right to say, I exist here. And if you haven't heard this story, definitely go find SJ on Instagram. I watched one of their most recent videos and they were explaining just basically what I did, but from their point of view. And of course, hearing it from their mouth and their passion and emotion, it really hits home. So it's definitely worth finding. I'll put their Instagram in the show notes below. And with that, we're going to get on to the third and final story of the week. And honestly, it's something that I'm really confused about because why have I only seen one person speak on this? And why did I have to dig so flippin' deep to get any real information on this? But I did it so that you did not have to. Part 3. What actually happened at NSA and whether the feds can now spy on people for being trans. This one is spicy, and I love spicy, but it's also very complicated. You may have seen posts, maybe. I didn't see a lot. I saw one or two. You may have seen posts saying that the NSA mass fired all queer officers, and they changed the rules so the government can spy on you for being trans. That is a lot. I'm going to walk you through what really happened, what is a rumor, what is verified, and what changed in federal surveillance policy that should have your attention. So here's our quick little plan. We're going to go over a timeline. Who got fired and why? How LGBTQ plus chat rooms became ground zero. What the Department of Homeland Security, not the NSA, actually changed about surveillance rules. And how that fits into the larger legal landscape, like FISA Section 702 and Executive Order 12333. Good God, that made no sense, but that's okay because I'm going to go a little bit slower. But also, we are going to mention sexual content in workplace chats because that is central to the story. There's nothing like outlandish, but like if that could trigger you, now's the time to let me go. On with the show. And this next part is a long one. Let's talk about the spark that lit this fire ablaze, leaked chat logs, and a very public crackdown. So here is where this started. On February 24th, 2025, the conservative magazine City Journal published excerpts they said were from IntelLink, the intelligence community's internal collaboration platform. The piece claimed some channels included lurid sexual discussions, everything from polyamory to gender-affirming surgery. Now, City Journal is opinionated. I'm not endorsing their framing, but the existence of the logs and the channels became the hook for what happened next. 2 days later, on February 26, Reuters reported that more than 100 intelligence community employees, not all of them at NSA, but across different agencies, were fired for using a secure government chat for sexually explicit conversations. That number, 100 plus, comes from DNI Tulsi Gabbard herself. She also ordered a wider investigation into IntelLink chat rooms. So, yes, a lot of people were removed. No, it was not all queer NSA officers. That claim is false. ABC News added an important detail that some of the activity happened inside LGBTQ affinity spaces on IntelLink. And they had different names for, I guess, what I'm imagining is like different chat rooms or different ongoing group conversations. Those said platforms involved were hosted by NSA. That is why NSA is in so many headlines, even though the directive covered the broader intelligence community. ABC also reported that participants were told they'd be dismissed quickly. That is harsh, and it's where the purge narrative caught fire online. Meanwhile, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence put out a press statement launching a formal investigation into all IntelLink chat rooms after discovering, this is quote unquote, this is their quote, obscene, pornographic, and sexually explicit content. That's the official rationale, and that would be misuse of government systems for explicit content, not identity. So the bottom line so far, the firings are real, large, and tied, at least on paper, to explicit content in work systems. Many discussions appear to have been in LGBTQ plus oriented spaces, which makes this feel targeted, but the official justification is content, not identity. So were queer officers fired? Here's the careful version you can use. We do not have evidence that all queer NSA officers were fired. What we do have is this. a D&I directive and public statement that 100 plus employees were fired for violating workplace and system use rules. ABC reporting that the explicit chats happened in channels including LGBTQ spaces that were hosted on NSA systems. That implies disproportionate impact in queer spaces, which absolutely raises discrimination concerns, even if the written policy says content. And then it makes me wonder, would they go after people that were sharing straight yet inappropriate content at work? Are those people being targeted or let go in the same fashion? Because we don't have a lot of information, it's kind of hard to tell. So they are using the word purge, like they're purging the system. And is that a fair word? And emotionally, it's accurate for the folks inside those communities. It's not legally precise. What we can say with confidence, there was a broad enforcement action that landed hard on the LGBTQ labeled channels during a political moment where DEI programs are being dismantled across the federal government. And that context matters. Now, next, this is a bit of a separate note, but related, separate but related, DEI firings in other intel agencies. So at the same time, there was a second track of firings. Employees at CIA and ODNI who worked on DEI initiatives. In late February, a judge denied a request to halt those firings. Then, on March 31st, another federal judge blocked the administration from firing dozens of those workers while litigation proceeds. So the legal picture is mixed and active. Don't let people collapse this DEI case into the Intel Link chat case. They're related politically, but they're different legally. And I think that's where these two messages are being confused and lost, equally as important. But when you put those together as if they're coming from the exact same story in the same jurisdiction or in the same agency, rather, it makes it a lot bigger than it might actually be. So the takeaway is that those are two parallel stories: explicit chat firings tied to Intel Link channels and attempted DEI firings of staff partly paused by the courts. Two separate stories, equally as important. Now, the big policy change that everyone's talking about wasn't at the NSA, it was at the Department of Homeland Security. Now to the they changed the rules so they can spy on people for being trans claim. That's what I'm hearing, that's what I'm reading, that's what I'm seeing. And what actually changed? Let me tell you. In February 2025, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis quietly removed language in its policy manual that prohibited intelligence activities based solely on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Oh, Lord, I need a breath. That is a mouthful. That's not NSA. It's DHS's Domestic Intelligence Unit. Bloomberg government broke this story. That removal alarmed civil liberties and LGBTQ plus groups for obvious reasons. Then, in March 2025, DHS updated the manual again. It restored protections for sexual orientation, but did not restore the explicit protections for gender identity and gender expression. So, as of that update, the manual again said, don't do intel work based solely on sexual orientation. But it no longer said that about gender identity or expression, and that is meaningful and narrowing. This has been reviewed and claimed as true that DHS ended a ban covering LGBTQ plus surveillance as to certain categories. Again, advocacy organizations have condemned this rollback, naturally so. And here's an important nuance. So even without those words, DHS is still bound by other laws: the First Amendment, the Privacy Act, and internal US person rules. The change doesn't say go spy on trans people. It does remove explicit guardrails that sent a clear message to analysis, like identity alone is never a basis. But removing that language increases risk of abuse and has chilling effects, especially in a climate where LGBTQ plus spaces are already under suspicion. So what gives the government these powers? We've got two big pillars here, and this is where this gets very wordy, but Executive Order 12333. This is the broad authority for intelligence collection, especially outside the US. It governs NSA's core mission. It doesn't say target people for being trans. It sets the general framework and requires each intel element to have procedures for handling US person information. And then there's FISA Section 702. This authorizes targeting non-US persons abroad, but incidentally collects Americans' communications. It was reauthorized in 2024 and now sunsets in April 2026, sparking ongoing reform debates and court fights about warrantless backdoor searches. If you're worried about domestic surveillance, this is where a lot of the fight is. All right, so what actually went down? Let's clean up this timeline and simplify this, right? February 24th, 2025, City Journal publishes the leaked Intel link chat. Many are LGBTQ plus themed and sexual. NSA is named as the platform host. February 26th, Tulsi Gabbard says 100 plus intelligence staff across agencies are being fired over sexually explicit chats on government systems. She orders a broader review. Reuters and ABC confirm and add details about the LGBTQ plus labeled channels and NSA hosting. Late February, early March-ish, separate litigation over firing DEI staff at CIA ping-pongs. First, a judge denies an emergency halt. Then, on March 31st, another judge blocks many of the firings pending the case. So it's really just back and forth. Then February 2025, DHS INA quietly removes manual language barring intel activity based solely on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. March 2025, DHS restores sexual orientation to the protected list, but not gender identity or gender expression. And that, my friends, is the picture. Firings tied to explicit chat use on work systems, a separate legal fight about DEI layoffs, and a policy narrowing at DHS that worries trans advocates. Well, let's talk about how I'm reading this because, quite frankly, it doesn't matter how many times I read it or go over it. Like, I'm speaking, but I don't even know if I'm grasping it. And, like, here's if you want to discuss it with others, here's how to discuss it without getting burned, right? So, here is the tight, responsible take. There was a big firing wave in the Intel community, which was tied to explicit chat content. No, it was not all queer NSA officers. The firings were not officially because people were queer. They were justified as misuse of systems, but because LGBTQ plus labeled channels were involved, the enforcement fell heavily on queer spaces. Both things can be true at once. And I have also heard that some of these apparently sexually explicit conversations were actually people talking about how it was different to sit down peeing after a gender reassignment surgery or things that aren't really sexual. And I'm sure there's much worse things on there from some of the straight white men running the joint. Anyway, bringing it back. Yes, DHS narrowed its manual in a way that removed explicit protections for gender identity and gender expression. That doesn't create a free-for-all, right? But it does give some people the go-ahead, which is exactly what we don't want to happen. We want a guardrail so we are protected to prevent biased targeting. I'm gonna be a news broadcaster for a second, okay? Reports that all queer NSA officers were fired and the government can now spy on you for being trans mashed together a real but messy set of events. Over 100 Intel staff were fired for explicit chats on government systems, some of which happened in LGBTQ labeled channels. Separately, a court partially blocked the administration from firing DEI staff, and DHS, not NSA, narrowed its policy manual, removing explicit protections for gender identity and gender expression as a basis for surveillance, then partially walked it back for sexual orientation. The stakes are huge, but accuracy matters. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. I can't even talk about this anymore. My brain is so fucking full. I need a drink or I need a nap. But in closing for this section, if you work in government, here's the practical advice. Do not use official systems for anything that could be construed or explicit, ever. We know that. That should be true no matter your identity, no matter where you are, no matter what your sexual orientation or gender, whatever. So it is shitty that the LGBTQ plus community was targeted at a much higher percentage. And was that done on purpose? Were some things taken out of context? Probably so. And for the rest of us, don't share the all queer NSA staff were fired, okay? That's not a factual story. It is wrong, and it distracts from the real documentable issue at DHS and the broader surveillance powers that need reform. Okay, exhale. If you want more sources, it's in the show notes. Maybe. Did I put it there? Who knows? Anywho, that's going to be a wrap on today's episode of Hot Air. 3 stories, 3 reminders that our rights, our visibility, our dignity are constantly under attack, but also that we are not powerless. We can speak up, we can push back, and we can make noise. From Indonesia to Yosemite to Washington, D.C., these stories are more than just headlines. They are lives, they are people, and they are battles worth fighting for. So the next time someone says, "Why do you care so much?" or "Things aren't that bad," remember these 3 stories. Remember what I talked about today, and remind them that silence only helps the oppressor, whether it's globally or next door. So thanks so much for hanging out with me today. And if you love this episode, make sure you subscribe, you leave your review, you share it with a friend who needs to hear it. Find me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod. You can head over to my website, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com, and you could submit your stories for when I do my listener tale episodes. So until next time, stay loud, stay proud, and stay unapologetically you. And I will see you next Tuesday.